Welcome to the Acid Capitalist podcast. We are back for another week, people. And it was remiss of me last week and the last few weeks. I've not sort of maybe laid the table, set out the rules of engagement. This is a podcast where we discuss all things macro, finance, all sorts of issues, bring everything in. Between me and my co-host, we have 15 years running a global macro hedge fund, cumulatively between the two of us. And my name is Chris Sweeney, otherwise known as the Alchemist on this show, and the other half of this partnership, who probably has the majority of the 15 years running a global macro hedge fund, is the acid capitalist himself, Mr. Hugh Hendry, out in St. Bart's. How are you?
I'm in shock trying to count up the number of seconds you did not spend managing a macro hedge fund. But I'm well. I'm full of I'm charged with electricity. We've had 3 challenging podcasts in a row. Can we put this one to bed? Will we still be dealing with these damn technical issues, or will people just see that here we are and we're going to introduce the wonderful Lawson Steele, who is contributing on a busy day when he could be doing many other things? He could be full of shock at the profound U-turn by the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister. Tax cuts for the rich. One day, did we say that? We've changed our mind. In fact, actually, one of the golden rules of macro investing is being able to profoundly reject everything you held dear the day or the second before. With no further ado, Chris, what are we going to do?
Well, we're going to get into it. As you've mentioned his name, he's the second most famous Steele in the world after Danielle, of course. But still in our hearts, he's no less of a Steele than Danielle. But he's Mr. Lawson Steele. He is essentially an expert in the EU carbon market. He's a leading voice, a commentator, an analyst. He's been around a very long time, so he's got a lot of wisdom to impart, and we are honoured to have him alongside us today. How are you, Lawson?
I'm very well, thanks. Very well. Good to be here. Thanks for having me. I have actually been to Danielle Steele's house in San Francisco some moons ago, to be fair.
Are you related?
No, we're not.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background. As I've said, you're a leading commentator in the space. For people maybe that don't know you or haven't come across your stuff, maybe you could just give us a wee brief overview of your career and how you've got to where you are right now.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've been an analyst, institutional analyst for the last 35 years, working at UBS and Berenberg, amongst others. I've worked in London, New York, and so on. And since 2004, 1 year before the scheme kicked off, I started analysing the carbon market, because that's integral to electricity prices and so on. And I became bearish from January 2006 when it's trading at 30 euros per tonne. 11 months later, I said it was going to go to zero, and it did exactly that 11 months later. And then in January 2018, I became bullish when it was at 8 euros. It had a high of 98, and now trading at 66. But that's kind of what I live and breathe these days, carbon, almost literally.
And how would you describe it right now on the ground? This moment, this second, what's the situation at Mark Freeburg? And then maybe we can expand the discussion from there. But right now, where are we?
There's a lot of noise at the moment. A lot of people worried about what retroactive measures or changes the EU might make to the system. I think it's going to be okay. And therefore, it's a matter of getting the carbon price up at some point to a meaningful level, which is well into triple digits.
Hugh, do you agree that everything's going to be okay? Everything's going to be all right. Do you agree, Mr. Hendry?
Chris, you're on fire. May I commend you. The challenge today is to try and reveal some of the language, some of the jargon which is associated with trying to get a comprehensive understanding of the European system. As regular listeners will know, that I think this time last year, Chris and I were knee-deep in our enthusiasm for this market. What this rare European elegant market-based solution to one of the big issues that's vexing humanity. How do we allocate these carbon emissions. Better that we allocate it rather than these kind of idiotic protest movements which seek that we take carbon emissions to zero immediately, that we stop all forms of pollution immediately. It's idiotic. It's idiotic and it's unfair because there's something like 6.5 billion people in the world who have not had the opportunity to reach our level of affluence and therefore our level of effluence, if that's the right term. And we can't just kind of impose this kind of class divide across the world. And indeed, the kind of the zero willingness to kind of reflect on slow but steady and elegant solutions to attaining a better future has left Europe vulnerable. That vulnerability is a supposed sovereign bloc which finds itself denied an independent, safe source of energy. I don't think you have sovereignty without a secure energy bloc, and so I find that Europe has found itself in the emergence of the re-emergence, if you will, of the 30-year war. The 30-year war was ended, I think, Lawson, you look like a historian, I think 1654 thereabouts, when the attempt to abolish Protestantism in northern Germany failed. I say 30 years. We have a war in Europe with the conflict over Ukraine that's dragging world powers. I say 30 years because of the time lags which will be necessary to build those nuclear power plants, to find a working, viable green hydrogen, to find locations other than Australia, to find the ability to ship more of the, what do you call it, LNG from North America and elsewhere. 30 years it will be required. So anyway, that's why we're talking about it again. The big conflict, and I think where we're going to begin with, Lawson, is just these filthy politicians and their interference, their deep desire to deflect. It is because of a generation of bad politics that Europe found itself vulnerable to the mess and the misery of this winter. It is on the politicians. It is not on this carbon scheme, and yet they are desperate to blame the carbon scheme. And I think that's where Lawson's going to come in. Lawson, please help me.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to control things in any way they can. But the bottom line is that, the carbon cost today is less than 5% of the electricity cost. And the remainder is all fuel cost and margin. So in other words, gas prices, which have gone up, 570% or so. 760% over the last 15 months. Whereas the price of carbon has gone up 42%. So it is absolutely wrong to blame the electricity price surge on carbon. Carbon, yes, has gone up a touch, but it's not the issue. And frankly, even if you curtailed, if you cut the carbon price in half by whatever measures you manage to put on the market, then you're talking about reducing the electricity price by 2.5%. It is absolutely irrelevant, and it's idiocy. If there's some accountability for politicians, if there ever was, then they would be strung up by their necks for blaming the electricity price on the carbon price.
Yeah, indeed.
Stop having a go, but it is absolutely wrong.
But almost a year has now passed. Almost. I guess we still have a few months. And so far, they have failed in their attempts. But where are we with that? I know there are particular steps that have to be reached in order to procure change, good or bad. Could you say something about that, please?
There's two basic issues going on at the moment. One is aligning the EU ETS, the emission trading scheme, with the Fit for 55 package, which is the EU now has a tighter goal for emission reductions by 2030, which is 55% instead of 40%. That percentage based on 1990 levels. So now they're looking to reduce their emissions by 55% from the 1990 levels. And the EU ETS has to be part of that. And there's that debate going on. And interestingly, the EU ETS scheme actually impacts or there's 40% of emissions in Europe which come under that scheme's umbrella. The other 60% are those industries outside it, typically transport, buildings, and agriculture, amongst the major ones. So the rest are within the EU ETS scheme. Now, the interesting thing is that although the European-wide target is 55% reduction for 2030, the brunt is being put on the EU ETS system, and the requirement is to reduce emission levels by 61%, which means that the other emissions outside of the scheme, the 60% out, will need to obviously reduce their emissions by less than the headline 55. So first of all, there is definitely still a strong impetus to get this, quote, cornerstone policy of the EU's fight against climate change sort of further tightened up. But then the other issue is that you've got this Repower EU, which is obviously the big charge to try and find alternative energy sources for the EU away from Russia. And amongst the financing modus operandi to get the money for that Repower EU, they've been suggesting at the Parliament level, we'll come back to that, that there should be 20 billion euros to come out of this EU ETS scheme. Now, the way they're doing this, or proposing to do this, those who are proposing it, is to use carbon allowances from something called the MSR, the Market Stability Reserve, which essentially is a pool of carbon allowances which have been taken out of the system. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about supply being the driver, if you remind me. And these allowances, the idea is to generate 20 billion euros worth of revenues, which can be used for Repower EU, etc. But what annoys me at the moment, and it's kind of symptomatic of our times, that's if anybody has a voice, everybody can hear it, which is kind of good, but also kind of bad. But there are those within Parliament who are discussing this. It needs the whole of Parliament's approval, and then it needs Parliament, Council, and the Commission to approve. So in each one of those, or at least in the Council and Parliament, you need 2/3 majority to prove that. So for me, it's and then also you've got Council and the Commission who run much closer to the law, which is stop interfering, you lot. So for me, it's not a slam dunk, but the market is pricing in that it is, which is obviously an interesting opportunity.
And so what is there a target date for the vote?
Yeah, I mean, it's as usual. It's politics, so it kind of depends when they can be bothered to meet up and how long they want to debate for and blah blah blah. But I think over the next few weeks, by year end, we'll have clarity on this.
And do we have different? Obviously, use 27 countries. Do we have different push and pull factors from different parts of the EU, or is there different feelings? Or is there one particularly going one way, the other way? Is there a sort of general sort of feeling on that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Parliament has its 27 members. The Council has its 27 members. So, and even within that, if you think, there's two things which I always think about top down about the EU ETS. One, it is, as I mentioned, the cornerstone policy, which the EU has, their prime weapon to fight climate change and to stop it. And secondly, which is not in the wording, but it is an amazing source of revenues to the member states. Right. So at current prices, the EU annual auctions are around 45 billion euros. Right. So that is auctioned almost on a daily basis, collected by the EU and distributed immediately to the member states. So that means that someone like Poland, for example, is getting 16% share of that, right? These are huge amounts of money. To put it in perspective, the danger is when we talk about billions and trillions and so on is that we glaze over and we can't really kind of work out what exactly it is. 40 billion was the Brexit bill. Okay, so this is greater than the Brexit bill at today's prices, and it is recurrent. Right, the Brexit bill was a one-off 40 billion, and what's more, if my prices are right, that's going to double, triple from where we are, maybe even quadruple. So it's just important to really to remember that. So yes, there's different factions within each country, let alone within Parliament and Council. But the finance ministries of each country bloody love carbon. Then the other guys who are not too sure about it.
Lawson, is there also a kind of fight between them and us? Where you mentioned Poland, and I believe I'm right in saying that Poland is still quite a large indigenous producer of coal, and therefore that may set itself, whilst the carbon credits are much appreciated, the notion of kind of abolishing or trying to put its indigenous coal out of business seems to rankle. So is that where you find the greatest pushback within the parliament? Is it from states such as Poland, or am I off piste?
No, I think you're right. Poland at the moment is anti everything EU in terms of rhetoric and trying to get more, get a better deal. And that's the way they've always negotiated. They attack on all fronts, and carbon is one of them amidst all the others. And actually, that's why in November 2014, the EU changed the approval process from unanimous to a qualifying majority, which works out at around 2/3, because they got fed up with putting proposals together, and Poland would say niet, or I'm not good on Polish, but they say no anyway, and they would spoil the party, and they either had to be given a backhander or kowtow, and the thing fell down. So they got fed up with that, changed the whole approval process. But the other thing to remember is that from so carbon has different periods, and the initial period, or the initial two periods, ran to 2012. And up to 2012, every single company got 95% free allowances. In other words, if they produced 100 million tons, there's actually worth just doing a quick sidestep. So the way the carbon scheme works is that every 30th of April, you go to your government, cap in hand, and say, "Forgive me, Father, I've sinned, I've emitted 10 million tons of carbon." To which you say, "Well, you can be absolved if you give me the 10 million carbon allowances. And if you don't, if you've only got 6 because there's a shortage of 40% of the market, then you have to pay a penalty on those 4 million you haven't delivered, which is currently about 122 euros per permit. And then on top of that, you still have to deliver those allowances the following year, irrespective of that following year's emission level." So that's how it works. So going back to 2012, everybody got 95% free allowances, so they only had to buy that additional 5%. From 2013, European utilities, i.e. electricity companies, which account for about half the emissions in the EU ETS, all of a sudden had 0 free allowances. So they went from 95% to 0. So they had to buy from 5% to 100%, except the Eastern European utilities. And they got another soft landing deal, which sort of came down year by year over a decade kind of thing. So A, they've already had an extremely lenient treatment, and B, there are funds from something called the Innovation Fund, which is there to help funds innovate, projects innovate, but also the Modernization Fund. And the Modernization Fund, this is all within the EU ETS. But the Modernization Fund is there simply, as it suggests, to help Eastern European countries modernize. But the reality is that Poland hasn't done very much. They built some renewables, of course, and from about 2017 onwards, and now it's kind of beginning to be somewhat relevant. But they've done diddly squat really for the last decade, and now they're whinging.
Well, we whinge a lot on this show. So I'm gonna just ask you a question, and then we might pivot a little bit. But because we began with one of the fears that saw the carbon price be dragged down from 98 to 66, let's say, is this notion of further political jawboning and trying to change the elegant system. Okay, we talked about the EU ETS. We talked about, it sounded like FITPA. That's what Scottish people call football, but the reduction scheme and the big reduction scheme. And just for those listening, because we're saying, well, when is it going to be passed into legislation? There are question marks, but we're actually talking about, in terms of the carbon trading scheme, it's a reality today. So just the first point, just to clear up the uncertainty, what is it that's still to be passed by this qualified majority? Can we just put a closure on that before we pivot, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, but there's these two issues. One is this 20 billion euros to be raised from the MSR. That's one issue. And separate to that, but running at the same time, I guess, is this Fit for 55. So this is where you're changing the target level of emissions from reducing them by 61% versus 1990 instead of the, I guess, currently existing 40% target. And what that entails is a more rapid reduction in the cap. So the way the EU ETS works is that every year up till now, they reduce the number of allowances in the system by about 2.2% per annum. And now that is going to, as the proposal stands, leap up to about 4.2, 4.3% per annum from, depending when they approve it, 23, 24. There might also be a one-off sort of reset alongside that as well. So that is the main thing, sort of about further tightening that cap to deliver those emission levels.
Yes. So now I understand. So we have the existing scheme, and the changes we're talking about are changes to incorporate the more ambitious carbon offset plan for 2030. So with the pivot, can we begin with the blue sky? This is all very crisp and Odie like, but it's like, I got a pen, I got paper, give me kind of the figures for the back of the fag box kind of thing, and let's just, because again there might be people coming at this afresh, so we want the existing carbon prices, let's call it $66, but there are moving parts, and let's try and touch upon the moving parts and construct the bullish, if not the hyper bullish case before then we might try and knock holes in it with a critique, if we could do that. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I think, well, let's go back to what I was explaining about the year-end delivery or compliance requirements. So April the 30th, you go to your government and you tell them, I have an audited emission level of 10 million tons last year. And you know that therefore you're going to be asked for 10 million allowances to sort of clean the slate. Now, if you know that in advance, and here we are today, and we're heading to, say we're 3 months, whatever out from 30th of April, and we haven't got enough allowances, and we know that if we don't deliver those allowances, we will be fined 122 euros per allowance. Then obviously we're going to try and buy the allowances. Everybody will be in the same position.
Yeah, and forgive me, Lawson, but just because I'm anticipating the audience going, 122 per allowance and I know the answer to this, but anyway, but when the spot price is half that. So maybe if you could just kind of clarify the calculation behind the 122, if you will, fine for those who did not have the wherewithal to provide the allowances for their pollution.
Yeah, the 122 is simple. It's a 2013 penalty of 100 euros, which gets increased each year by inflation. So it's now 122 for next April.
Okay, thank you.
Give or take. So if you know then, haven't got enough, so you try and buy these permits, there aren't enough to go around, and therefore the price goes up. In the first instance, you will be prepared to pay up to just short of 122 euros to buy the allowance rather than have to pay the penalty. So that's your first opportunity cost, if you like. But then you realize that if you haven't bought them, your penalty price is not only 122, that's your penalty, that's your formal penalty price, but you've got an additional cost, which is that you still have to buy these allowances for delivery the following year, right? So your options are deliver this year or next year with a penalty. But of course, now the allowances are trading 122, so your opportunity cost is actually the 122 penalty plus the cost of allowances, which are 122, so actually 244, right?
No, I'm lost there. Sorry.
Okay.
So let me try and gauge what you said. So I've got it. I've overpolluted beyond what my internal models were telling me. I've discovered I've got 10. I've overpolluted to the tune of, let's say, 10 million tons, right, of carbon. I could go into the market today and try and buy those credits from speculators and from others who might have a surplus, and the bidding for that begins at $66, and I've got an incentive to pay all the way up to 122. Let's say no one will sell to me, so I've got to go back and say, bugger, okay, hit me with the fine, $122 times my 10 million, and I write the check out one times the other, and that's for the year which will end this, April 2023. Now, what I get, there's a jump which I don't get, is for the year which will end April 24. You seem to be saying that I've got to do that again, or is that on the basis that I continue to overshoot in my carbon pollution?
So let's say that 2024 is, you've emitted again 10 million tons, and for some reason you've got to give 10 million allowances, but you've also got to give the 4 on which you were penalised last year. So you're never ever forgiven delivery of the allowances.
Okay, so
this year or next year with a penalty.
But you're assuming. Sorry, you said the 4. So you're assuming I had an overshoot of 10. I bought 6, but I had to go back and pay a fine on 4 tons. Is that what you're presuming there?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not an overshoot, by the way. It's just actually your year emissions, I'm saying.
What I'm saying is an overshoot with regard to your internal pollution monitor spreadsheet, that you think, because you would think that these businesses, they would be doing some form of audit. I've just done something.
Yeah, but you see, you're I think you're giving too much credit to the internal workings of companies and being savvy to what they need to do on the carbon front. In reality, there is a lot of sort of call it poor knowledge in the system, where and in some cases, many cases, maybe the carbon price or carbon cost is just not that material to industries yet, which is why I think it has to go up. But maybe if you've got a business which has a 20% EBITDA margin, say, and your costs of carbon are point something %, then the FD or the CFO really won't give her two monkeys about it. On the other hand, if you have a margin of 2%, and all of a sudden there's a 1% increase in your costs, you're going to want to know what it is. But today, I think a lot of them fall into the former category.
Okay, so I get that, Lawson. So again, let me try again just to play catch up with your deep well of knowledge. So I have polluted to the tune of 10 million tons of carbon. I have been able to buy credits or find credits within my allocation to the tune of 6 million, but I have to pay a fine of 4. Are you saying that actually the system works on the basis that unlike purgatory and the ascent into heaven, you're never forgiven? That the 4 million, the stain of the 4 million that you were unable to recoup in terms of offering the credit stays with you in perpetuity, and so you'll be charged 4 million times the penalty in perpetuity?
No, I'm saying I think two things. So first of all, you give them the 6, and you're left with the 4 liability. On that 4 liability, you pay a fine. You write a check for 122 times the 4 million, and next year, by April 30th of April 2024, you have to give them 4 million to clear your 2023 liability. Should you not do so, if you don't deliver the full amount of 10 million permits in those 2 years, then there are nasty legal consequences, which probably end up in jail, or God knows what.
Okay, so again, like just to keep me out of jail, so April 23 comes around. I do my credit trading, try and procure the 6, achieve the 6. I've got the shortfall, but actually I've got up until April of 24 to deliver the penalty fee. Is that what you're saying?
You have until April 2024 to deliver the 4 million shortfall, but because you have not delivered the 4 million by April 2023, you get penalized immediately and write a check for 122 times 4 million.
Is it a bit like a library book? I mean, I know this is a bit of a jump here, but is it a bit like you pay the late fine, but you still got to give the book back? I mean, the fine does not absolve you from everything. You've still got to deliver the actual thing.
Yeah, a bit like that. Although I guess you're delivering some of the book, but not all the pages, and then you've got to give the rest of the pages back a year later.
Yeah, no, I was just doing that. And one quick thing before while we're on this thing, how is this checked? How is this audited? How do you know if someone's actually emitted 10 when they've? I mean, I assume governments can't check every single business. That would not be feasible.
No, but each business has an auditing requirement put upon them, and they have to do that. That's part of, just like they have to audit their accounts and everything else. It's not a complicated thing to audit.
Again, I'm still trudging through sludge, if you will. So I'm on it, right? I've got really good internal systems, and before April 23, I get it. I've done 10 million. I've got 6 in the bag in terms of credits, and I've been in, and I've gone to my regulatory counterparty, and I've said, okay, here's the money for the 4 million, and by the end of April of 2023, I've paid you, 400. Like, what would that be? That would be, the best part of half a bit. Is that $500 million? 122 times 4. I've paid you that. I've offered you the credits on the 6. Does that mean that 1 year hence, I don't have to pay you another 4 million times 122?
You only pay the penalty once, but you have to deliver the 4 million the following year.
Right. So the following year, yeah. So that's Chris's point. Well done, Chris, actually. I got to actually return with the damn library book and say, sorry, there you go. I paid the fine the previous year, but I've actually got to return the library book. Okay, right. Okay, please continue and forgive me my interventions.
No, that's right. So now you've realized that actually, we got to the point where the price has gone up to 122 because there is a shortage of permits in the market, and therefore everybody bids up and goes up to just about that penalty price. Josh,
bosses, forgive me again. Sorry, but so I think this would be an apropos moment to discuss the market for the credits and how it was loose. The 2008 chapter to 2018 chapter perhaps was loose, but now it's been tightened, and the polluters don't necessarily have these they don't have these free allocations. They have to buy credits to support their pollution. Can you just say something in terms of the tightness of the underlying credit market?
Yeah, I mean, I as I said at the intro, in January 2006, I said it's going to go to 0, and it did, from 30 to 0 about 11 months later. And then I personally got bored with the whole system, although I followed it and occasionally updated my model and so on. But the reason you had this, they went to 0, is because they had a massive oversupply. Everybody had lied about their emissions because they weren't audited, and they'd exaggerated, and they got lots of free allowances, and they saturated the market, and I'd kind of worked that out. And then that was what they had as their test phase. And from 2008 onwards, once they had all the audited data, they rebalanced the whole system. And then we had the financial crisis, which meant that industrial production was way lower than anticipated. Yet the supply carried on cranking out these allowances because they set the number of allowances which are going to be sold from 2008 to 2030 per annum back in 2008. So irrespective of what emissions were doing, they carried on cranking out the allowances. So you ended up with an oversupplied system. The carbon price was dwindling at 2, 3, 4 euros with a bit of optionality value, but really not worth very much at all, and certainly not delivering anything on the environmental front. And they had a number of attempts to tighten the market to get a meaningful carbon price to help reduce emissions. They're all rather stupid systems from 2013 onwards. And then eventually they come up with this idea of the MSR, the Market Stability Reserve, which I got wind of in late 2017. And then I thought, well, here we go again, yet another stupid sort of a system proposed by the EU. I'll just update my model. It will take me 2 or 3 hours or something. It took me 6 weeks, because every time I dug into this, I thought, surely this can't be right. And I realized eventually that actually this is a system which is going to be super tight now. And this it's a weird system, right? I'm not a great fan of the system and the way it works, or the way it's set out originally, because it's a cap and trade system. And as we know, with the cap and trade system, it's either oversupplied, in which case prices go towards zero, or it's undersupplied, in which case they go up a lot. And over the next 4 years or so, by 2024, we're going to have a cumulative supply shortfall of 100%. In fact, in excess of 100%, which means that by 2024, you won't be able to buy any of your required allowances in the market from issues that year. So it's getting progressively tighter. And yeah, sure, if we have this 20 billion euros from the MSR release, that will soften that picture, but it is still undersupplied in my book. So this is why I keep on going. Why I introduce the idea of the 10 million versus only being able to buy 6 million, because it is a tight market. Now, the way this MSR works is a mechanical exercise, as a formulaic, I should say, where it says what are the total number of allowances which are out there today, which are held in balance sheets, which are in your pockets, permits in your pocket, if you like. And that number at the moment is about 1.5 billion. So these are allowances which in the past have been issued, and for some reason, they have indefinite life, by the way, and for some reason haven't been utilized in the annual compliance. And people refer to this as the surplus. And I used to, until I discovered that actually it's not really a surplus, it's just the working capital of the system. But if that number exceeds this mystical number of 833 million, then the MSR kicks in, and it will multiply that number by 24%, which works out to about near enough 400 million, and take that out of the pre-scheduled auction supply, which was set back in 2008. So it is a very big reduction in the annual supply of allowances until that total float gets to 833 million, at which point you have zero reductions.
So wow. Again,
we are lost.
we're like Chris likes to say, we're the boys that gets the tea for the guy that gets the coffee for the likes of you. So in the tea room, we have more questions for you from just.
We're still trying to work the kettle in the tea room. That's the level we're at.
Because you try and find out which socket you plug that damn kettle into, and I'm going to ask Lawson a couple of questions. There was quite an extraordinary point you raised there, which you were saying that from the year 2024, those who have emitted carbon into the European atmosphere would be, unless they had kicking around some old allowances from previous years, they would be unable to buy those credits from the marketplace. Did you say that?
Yes.
Okay. And therefore, moving forward, that 10 million tons of pollution would be subject to a penalty charge, which would be 122 plus the intervening inflation of the last 2 years, whatever.
Yeah.
And that would be a liability that would actually change its status into a perpetuity, because you'd be unable to find the 10 million and therefore to clear the slate with the penalty. You'd be confronted with a perpetuity of 10 million times the penalty charge. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
And I mean, that in itself surely would, I mean, that sounds crazy, but I mean, that would effectively, wouldn't that just in itself bring an end to pollution? Or is it the fact that even at 122, and even when you make it into perpetual state, I mean, no, but when you make it into perpetual state, it is a big deal for any corporation in Europe, no? Because the sum there is, what is the sum? The sum is going to be the 10 million times 122, and then to put it in a perpetuity state, you've got a growth function of inflation. Heavens, I mean, you know, that becomes it's a billion liability.
But obviously, you know, it won't be allowed to go that high, because if it's doing that, then there will be political intervention, right? And I've always said, right from January 2018, when we're down to €8, I said, you know, what's the risk of this? And I said it's going to be political intervention at some point, which we're getting at the moment on where we are today, at least via this MSR Repower EU thing. But you know, it's actually worse than that, because if I go back to the pricing example I was talking about, where you know, in the first instance, you're 4 million short, so you're worried about your opportunity cost of 122, and then still not being able to buy those permits, you'll have to pay that penalty of 122 and buy those permits for delivery the following year, which are trading now at 122, so your opportunity cost is 244. But then you realize that, okay, I'm prepared to pay up to 244 to avoid that opportunity cost. Everybody tries and buy these permits. Everybody realizes that the price goes to 244. You still haven't bought them because there aren't enough in the market. And now your penalty price is still 122 plus the opportunity cost of buying the allowances, which is trading at now 244. So you're actually at a 366. And that just goes on to infinity. That's just maths. So in a situation where you have a significant shortage, which you do, then the price of carbon goes to infinity unchecked. Now, what will happen?
And forgive me, but just again for people tuning in, that's similar to the stale for now it's stale, the stale enthusiasm for Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, that would be saying that Bitcoin could replace the entirety of the gold market. You would say the gold market value is 10 trillion. You divide 10 trillion by the 21 million units, the fixed supply, and you get a target price. I'm not saying it's exact, but that's kind of similar to the kind of blue sky thinking that you find in alternative asset classes. That's neither here nor there with regard to what you're saying, Lawson.
Yeah, but I don't think it's quite as far-fetched as that, because the EU ETS is utilizing all the data out there and applying this logic. So it's not if it's replacing or need to think about will it replace gold or whatever. It's a self-contained system.
Yeah, no, indeed. There's no conjecture. This is reality. This is like a beast that is like Pac-Man, and Pac-Man is winning. Okay, so and then you were going to say.
So obviously, if the carbon price going to infinity is ludicrous, so something will stop that happening.
And is that the market stability reserve? You know, so the 833 million tons is that forgive me, is that the annual allowance, or is what again?
No, so the MSR kicks in if the total float of allowances exceeds 833 million. and there's 1.5 billion in the system today.
So, so there's 1.5 billion, right? What are we subtracting from the 1.5 billion to determine the surplus or whatever?
Well, then you've got to take into account why I realized it wasn't a surplus. You've got to take into account that there's a lot of hedging requirements for this. So, for example, utilities will hedge or lock in their margins. So when they sign a contract of electricity with someone who wants, I don't know, a 2-year deal for the sake of argument, they're not going to risk what happens to the fuel cost, what happens to the carbon cost. They'll say, okay, I will guarantee you a price of 200 for the sake of argument, and immediately their trader will go and lock in the price of fuel. So I want that, I need this amount of fuel over the next 2 years at this price, and they will buy the carbon as well and keep that carbon on their balance sheet. So that is, as we call it, hedging their position. So utilities have a huge amount of carbon on their balance sheets. In fact, I spoke to CFO of RWE, the biggest polluter in Europe, back in Q1 2018. And I said, look, we need to chat about, normally I'd ask for an hour of your time, but this time I want to give you an hour of my time. And we talked about the carbon market and the way I saw it. And on the back of that, they've gone and built a very large position which protects them all the way to sort of 2030 kind of thing. So a huge amount is in their balance sheet, and other utilities too. So and then you have industries who are waking up to carbon, as I said, in many cases still not very significant for them, and they will begin to hedge more and more. So by the time you do all that and take into account the annual deficits in the system, you end up with actually, that so-called 1.5 billion surplus is no more than the working capital of the system, which is fully utilized. So therefore, when you look at the annual sort of deficits, and you realize that actually this thing is undersupplied.
So there is a magical figure which I need to get a grip on, which is 667 million tons, which is the difference between 1.5 billion and the 833 million. What is it?
I'd separate, right? So let me explain. So you got 1.5 billion, which is sitting in your pocket for the sake of argument, and any industrial or utility, they're all sitting there on the balance sheet. So that's what has been issued in the past, is floating around the system today, has not been utilized to comply. Then there's two things. The annual supply of allowances, irrespective, because I can do the 1.5 billion, the number of allowances sold each year by the EU, is on a very straight line reduction of 2.2 to 4% over the coming years. But in addition to that, should the free float, the 1.5 billion, exceed this mystical number of 833, then you multiply the float, which is 1.5 billion, by 24%, which is 400 million, and deduct that from the annual supply of allowances coming out. Should the 1.5 billion, which of course would drop next year by 400 million, ceteris paribus, to 1.1, should that still exceed 833, you will again multiply that 1.1 by 24% to give you whatever, 300 million or so. And that will be reduced from the following year's annual supply. By that stage, 1.1 falls to 800 million, which is below the mystical 833. And then, obviously, since it's below 833, the MSR no longer kicks in, and the supply returns to normality, by the straight line down to 2030. So you've got this straight line which can fall dramatically whilst the total supply of whilst the total float of allowances exceeds that mystical 833. So
does that mean? Why am I doing this? Does that mean that like the market has capitalized on its balance sheet 1.5 billion tons of the right to emit carbon, and you're saying that with the MSR, actually 24% of what has been capitalized will be deemed to be invalid and will not be accepted at the window when the regulator seeks credits for the polluter's pollution.
No, it does have its own sort of idiosyncrasies, and it's kind of important to get them right. So you've got let me give you two numbers. You've got 1,500, okay, which is the number of allowances which everybody owns in their pocket today. The annual supply, which are sold into the market by the EU, is about 600 million. Okay. Now, and that 600 million will decline by 2 to 3 to 4% over the coming years. But so let's put numbers. So let's say 2022 supply is 600 million, 2023 is 575 for the sake of argument. Okay, let's call that 3%, which I'm too tired to work out. So under ordinary circumstances, you go to 600 to 575 to 550 to blah, blah, blah per annum. But because the 1,500 in existence today in people's pockets and balance sheets exceeds this mystical 833 million threshold for the MSR, then you multiply the 1,500 by 24%, which is your 400 million, and therefore instead of selling 600 million in the market this year, you will sell 200. Next year, let's say the MSR 24% times 1,100 is 300 for the sake of argument. Instead of selling 575, you'll be selling 275. And then let's say that by 2024, you're below this 833 million threshold. Then instead of selling 550, you will sell 550 because there'll be no MSR deduction.
Wonderful. I get that. And I'm sure, Lawson, you can confirm this, when you're working the city, this is the dumbest conversation you have every day when you visit a client's office when they are looking at the market for the first time. So we're actually allowing people, I mean, it may be tedious, but if you want to know what hedge funds and speculators do, they have conversations of this nature where I have to draw down from your greater intel on this subject, but I have to be like the Labrador. My tongue kind of is hanging to the left or whatever, and I do this.
Thank God that's the case, because then that's why I have a job. But on the other hand, that's all I know, and you know lots of things about other things.
Yeah, surfing, and even then I'm not very good at it. But anyway, yes. So wow, wonderful. Right. So let's. How can we then go about trying to make a qualified opinion with regard to the veracity, with regard to whether the latent opportunity set that resides within the market price today of $66? I feel like we're getting good on the landscape, and therefore we're getting close now to creating an intellectual construct for determining fair value. I hate that term, but a prejudicial value on where the carbon should trade.
Well, let me just go back to, and this begins to answer your question, but if you go back, I said it goes to infinity, but it won't, because two things will happen. You'll have political intervention, which I talked about, but you'll also have demand elasticity. At the moment, demand is not very elastic. Yes, you have sort of fluctuations of industrial production based on what the economy is doing and so on, but which in turn, I'm making the link that industrial production is linked to emissions, one for one.
Lawson, could you just, it would be really helpful if you could comment on the impact of COVID as an example of a variable reducing industrial production and therefore reducing the pollution for that year 2020. How great was that?
I'm gonna throw one more thing, which I won't try and confuse you, but I'll give you another thing of the way this system works. So let me think. So we had production, just trying to work out here, what have I got here? So we had a fall in emission levels of about, give or take 100 million or so on the back of COVID. Then since then, it's kind of recovered a bit, obviously. Now, the thing is, the whole thing is kind of recessionary proof, because if you go back to that 1,500 million, the number of allowances floating around, if you have, for some reason, a surplus in 1 year of 100 million, then that would increase the float from 1,500 to 1,600. And because it's still above this mythical 833, in the following year, the MSR will be 24% times 1,600. So in other words, another 24 million on top of the 400, or at the 1,500 level. And therefore, the reduction in supply is that much higher in subsequent years because you had a surplus the previous year. And
wow. Yeah, that is recession proof. So, and again, the mechanism for that would be, so COVID reduces emissions by 100 million tons. And so what is the mechanism for generating that surplus of 100 which gets added onto allowances? Is it that the annual, I don't know how that happens.
So the annual supply, ceteris paribus, right? Let's freeze everything else because lots of moving parts. But the annual supply goes down by 2.2% per annum, right? So that's the 600 million they sold, last year, comes down by another 25 million, whatever, because it comes down by 2% or so per annum. That supply, come hell or high water, comes to market. It's just that the demand or the emissions are 100 million lower than they would have been. And therefore, you create, on that basis alone, a 100 million surplus.
Perfect. Get it. Wonderful. Thank you.
There's a lot going on here. A lot going on, a lot of maths, a lot of calculations. Yeah, complicated shit.
Mr. Sweeney, I hope you're taking notice because, this is...
No, I'm doing stickmen. I'm drawing stickmen in my notepad.
Listen, it's not that hard.
For fuck's sake. No, I'm getting the principles, but the numbers are hard. Don't be daft here. Everyone at home's going, it's complicated shit. I'm not saying it's not. It's cool to be part of it, but it's not. It's complicated stuff. Even you're having to go over it 3 or 4 times, and you're an experienced hedge fund dude.
It's not nuclear fusion. It's just I'm getting clarity, but once the figures fall into place.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying.
It's mechanistic. And again, unlike Bitcoin, where there's is profound conjecture, these are the facts with the caveat that our European friends, our political friends might, mess it all up. But yeah, again, I'm getting really excited. So right, where do we go next, Lawson?
So just to finish off what I was talking about, the price goes to infinity. It won't, because you'll have political reaction and you'll have a demand response. Although the day-to-day demand response is pretty limited, the whole point is to get, and this is why the EU tightened up the system via the MSR, is to get the carbon price to a level which triggers companies to think, Christ, it's actually worth me sort of building efficiency and carbon reduction into my processes. It's worth the investment because the return I'll get by not having to buy the carbon allowances is worth it. So then you get into the sort of conversation about what price is that. The problem is that most industries don't really know because carbon hasn't been sufficiently, the carbon cost hasn't been sufficiently high to them to warrant that kind of attention. But we do have some pointers, like the most efficient chemical company, and one of the most efficient chemical companies in Europe, BASF, had an analyst, Capital Markets Day, as they call it, several months or probably about a year ago now, at which they said, that as far as we're concerned, you need to see a carbon cost of 140 before it's worthwhile, which means actually they need to see the carbon price above 140 and consistently so for them to actually do anything. But then the speed at which you get an industrial reaction to a high carbon price, it's going to be really slow, because you've got to say, well, hang on a minute. In the first instance, it's got to get to that price. As I said, it's got to be above the level. It's got to be consistent. So about 3 months in, you probably say, okay. So the CEO pulls in all the engineers and says, right, ladies and gentlemen, you've done a fantastic job. We've got the state-of-the-art process, which has been honed to within an inch of its existence over the last 15 years. It's absolutely perfect. Now, will you go away and reduce the carbon emissions by 40%? The first reaction will be mouths agog. The second reaction will be some half-baked ideas coming out. And eventually, maybe 2 or 3 of those look sensible. So then you start running some more sort of a test on those, and eventually think, okay, actually this is the one we need to go for. And then you begin to do a rollout, realize you've screwed that up a couple of ways, and then you've got to sort of reset and do it again. Yeah, this is a multi-year process, and it requires money.
Yeah, well, it requires disclosure. It's a bit like the thing that lit me up and started my career was studying market-based accounting research. There's a sovereign need to impose on. I think they all have to do a green budget, but I would go further and say they actually have to calculate their liability using the prevailing carbon price, like 1 to 10 years out, so that investors can actually see that status quo trading in terms of not changing their flow. Yeah. My construction site started drilling again, but there's nothing like the cold fact of seeing several $1 billion of liabilities unless you do something.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that is happening. Okay, right. So there's the notion that we just know that between today's price of mid-60s and 140, the polluters, like the best, most efficient polluter, it's not going to move their dial. And so you could say you've got a free ride to $140 free-ish in terms of non-political intervention and not enough kind of job owning by corporates to the political master saying, oh, please change this, you're busting us, our competitiveness in the international stage is being ruined.
Yeah, I think there is undoubtedly political noise today because of anything which is impacting the consumer in whatever shape or minor form, and that's why we got this Repower EU, and they want the MSR to release some of the allowances it has and raise 20 billion euros worth of cash to help that finance that European repowering investment.
I didn't understand that 20 billion, because you were saying the annual auction of the credits itself generates a Brexit of 45 billion, which is then distributed to the member countries to spend as they please. Where does the 20 billion come from?
Well, the 20 billion is simply the EU says, what do they need? I can't remember what the total number was, 700 billion or whatever the number was. We need this amount to operate the Repower EU, which will get EU independent of Russia, which includes investments and all sorts of things, including renewables and blah, blah, blah. And we need sources of finance. So we're going to get some from the state budget, we're going to get this from there, and we'll have 20 billion from the European ETS system. And then the proposal is, how do we do that? Well, the MSR, because it's been taken permits out of the system, has a repository of these allowances. I use the word permits and allowances interchangeably. So these allowances are sitting there, and therefore, I know, we can flog some of those. The issue is that they're obviously they're sort of sticking their paw in the honey pot. They are potentially changing something which shouldn't be changed. So there is that sort of pushback, which we will see increasingly as the proposal goes away from Parliament to Council and Commission. So that's why I'm saying it's not given that this thing happens. The other issue is that 20 billion is rather stupid. And I can see why they're coming at it that way, but from the EU ETS perspective, we have no idea how many allowances that is, because it depends on the price, right? So is that I don't know. If the price is double, you only need half the amount of allowances, and if the price halves, you need 2 times the allowances that you need at the current price. So there's a bit of uncertainty on that. But I do think that I think, at today's price, to be specific, if it's spread over 4 years, which is certainly seems to be the most central scenario, then we're talking about 300 million permits or allowances, which is about 75 million per year.
So would that be raising the annual from 600 to 675 in your hypothetical example?
Well, it actually doesn't change the 600 because that's the fixed one. But instead of deducting 400 million from it, you'll take the 600, you deduct the 400, but you'll put 75 back.
Understood. So again, in the zany world of politics, you're seeking to heal the planet, etc., and to fund green energy and whatever to create a distance and independence from crazy Vladimir. But to get there, you go to the filthy corporate polluters and you say, "Hey, you want to pollute more? Here you go."
Yeah, it's absolutely bonkers.
Okay, so then, so I get to like feeling very comfortable buying these permits today, but I've just got enough space on at the end of my fag packet to do the blue sky. So can we kind of go to 2024? There are no permits available, and like where the rational buyer or like where the price would have to potentially trade to reflect that profound tightness?
I mean, in theory, infinity, but it's in practice, right? For me, it's going to be comfortably into triple digits. Comfortably. Is it 200? Is it 300? Is it 175? I don't know that. I can't.
But it's not 400. It's not 500. I mean, they're triple digit numbers.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? I mean, it could be. It'll depend on all sorts of political climates at the time. But I mean, if nothing's happening, if we have 4 years in, 3 years out from now, and we've done nothing to reduce our emissions, it's not that we're 3 years closer to doom, we're multiple years closer to doom, because every year we delay now is however many years of emissions at this level. It's at what point is climate going to be so unbelievably important that we don't give a shit about the Ukraine war? Because if we don't have a climate, there won't be any way to have a war on.
Well, indeed, and actually, part of the European war effort is to pollute more. We're turning back to, I believe Germany is burning more coal. The region is burning more coal. Can you just say, like, the effect of, if you will, political green compromise just to keep the lights on, what that's likely to do to the level of emissions, I guess, this year, which will pass into April 23?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just before I begin to answer that, the most important part of this whole story is that it is a supply story. Right? It's the MSR which reduces things. You can tit around with demand as much as you like, and it won't really have an impact on the overall supply deficit we have. But to be specific, you've got two things going on this year. You've got a fall in industrial output, which I've been forecasting for the second half. I got 3% reduction for the full year. That's much more conservative than the 1.5 or so, which the general economists are forecasting for Europe.
And Lawson,
I'm forecasting a 5% fall next year as well.
So
that translates into about 60 million of lower demand or emissions. But as you point out, one thing I predicted back in Jan 18 when I went bullish was that we would get the carbon price go up, And as a result of that, we would find that coal would be completely displaced to the extent that there was enough gas capacity by gas. In other words, coal-fired electricity, which produces twice as much carbon as gas-fired electricity, would essentially be on the death knell. Of course, what's happened, and that did exactly happen in 2019 and 2020, but then, of course, Ukraine comes along and you just don't have the gas now. So you have to produce with coal today because that's what's available. And that retrenchment from gas to coal is about 100 million of additional demand or emissions. So you're left with a net 60 million less from industrial output, but 100 million more from switching from gas back to coal. So net, you've got a 40 million increase in emissions.
Okay. And so that the 100 million in context in emissions, is that 100 on the run rate prior to Ukraine had been 600 million tons? Ish.
The 600 is what the EU sells,
which it tries to peg close to the demand for.
No, it doesn't do that.
No?
Okay. No. It doesn't give a toss about demand. It's basically saying, here we were in 2008 when we were selling. I can't remember what the number was, but was it 2? No, it can't have been that high. But let's call it 1,200 million. That's the amount of allowances we're selling. But let's say in 2008, the EU was selling about 1,200 million allowances, and they want to end 2030 with 400 million, say, something like that, which is that is a straight line decline of 2.2% per annum to reach this 61% reduction in emissions versus 1990. So that is a fixed line. So no matter what demand does, up or down, that's a fixed level.
When you were calculating the 100 million that you estimate from this interruption in the conversion from coal to gas, do you have an idea of, was that emissions this year will be up 20% owing to the catastrophe with Ukraine, or is it less than that?
No, it's less than that. I got emissions this year. Where are we? Sorry, just going through my model now. So
I get, but we need the emissions probably for the year 21, which would have been prior to the Ukraine thing, no?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things flying around here.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, you're talking about power emissions being actually coincidentally about 600 million, just over, and for last year. And
that'd be like 15%, 15% increase.
Yeah, and this year we got about 650 or so, because there's a few other things moving around. But if it was just that 100 million, that would be correct.
And then Lawson, also, could you just contextualize, the industrial output, your prediction for industrial output declining 3% this year, 5% next. What would it have been during the GFC, the 2009 period, the recession brought on by the near total demise of the banking sector in Europe?
Oh man, I don't have that off the top of my head, certainly. But what do we have? You probably remember more better than I, because you're looking at all the global stuff. What was the fall in the industrial output during those years?
Well, it was the most severe economic recession, I believe, since the end of the Second World War. I think it was on a par, if not greater, than what we saw in the 1970s with the oil price shocks, which is to say it was a lot,
Yeah. I don't have that.
Okay, no, we'll put a sticker on the screen telling the figures, so no problem with that. Now, I'm mindful of the time, but I did have a couple follow-up questions. We've done one, which was the Ukraine. Differences between the British and the European. Obviously, we transplanted, cut and paste the UK out of Europe with Brexit. Now UK's got its independent trading scheme, and I've got buddies who are doing, I don't know how, maybe you could help us, who are arbing between the prevailing prices, the UK, Europe. I'm amazed that you get that opportunity. Is it big? What are the variables there?
Well, originally the UK was extremely instrumental in designing the European system, and I know the guys who run both, of course. Then, of course, we split out of the EU, and the UK is a much smaller fragment by comparison to the whole of the EU scheme. But the schemes are pretty similar because there wasn't any point, they thought, in reinventing the wheel. Today, there's no linkage whatsoever between the two. I personally think that once all the divorced toys have been thrown out of the pram, then eventually we will link up with the EU ETS, and there will be, essentially you can utilize a European allowance to settle your UK sort of emissions and vice versa. But today that's not there. So those who are arbitraging between one and the two, I don't think that's a proper arbitrage because there's no link. But
can you say something as to the tightness of the comparative tightness of the UK scheme versus the given now that I think I get the European infinity trade, has the UK seems a kind of newer carve out. Have they left it with the same kind of perilous tightness?
The UK does have tightness. I haven't modeled the UK, so everything I know about the UK is more through following some commentaries and so on. Most people don't bother with the UK because it's just so much smaller than the EU at the moment. But it is tighter, but not by much, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Two more questions. The one that's pressing in my mind. So if I'm coming in and I'm buying the European carbon credits at $66, Euro bucks, let's say, my biggest risk, and it's related to my second question, my biggest risk, and it seems the most plausible risk, is a populist political movement to take away the speculative interest in the futures market. And indeed, the home of kind of market-based solutions, the US, has this Tom, Dick, and Harry really poor system because it regulates the footprint of speculators to such an extent that it makes speculation de minimis, and therefore it takes away the kind of the ability of the market to discover the true pricing. So if I'm coming in, if I'm running a thread on Twitter, I'm saying, wow, this thing really looks, in a world where everything looks vulnerable, how can I gauge that risk that the politicians actually take out people like me buying the futures?
Well, a number of things. I mean, first of all, this has raised its head to the point where the EU asked the ESMA, which is the financial regulator, to look at speculators and their position with the EU ETS and whether they were responsible for, at the time, the price rise. And they concluded that they had a preliminary conclusion saying, no, they're not. And then in January, I think it was, or February, they came back to the market with a proper full report, which didn't change its view. In other words, the speculators were fine and they weren't responsible. Also, I had a fireside chat with one of the EU carbon guys who said, look, the system was designed to incorporate financial investors. And frankly, even if we wanted to stop them, we couldn't, because they'll come up with some esoteric way of synthetic way of playing the market. But remember too that today, for example, with the price down at 66, there are hardly any financial investors in there. There are some shorts, but there's nobody on a long play. And the other thing too is that, speculators is a hell of a wide term, because yes, you got financial speculators, but you got utilities, right? Electricity companies who have trading platforms, and therefore they have trading or traders who are also not only buying the underlying requirements of the company, but trading around that. And you have oil companies doing exactly the same thing. So I know these guys. These guys also play the market, if you want to call it play. They speculate as to where the carbon price is going to go. But if you just took speculators out of the market, if you could do it, good luck with that. But if you could do it, you would make the market so illiquid, and the volatility would be unbelievable. It'd be a nightmare. So everybody would sort of wake up in April, think, "Oh, crikey, we've got to buy the stuff now," and everybody stampedes. Whereas in maybe January or December or now, there wouldn't be anybody around. It'd just be a complete horlicks. But the EU has looked at it and has said, the system was designed to incorporate them. The price has not gone up because of speculation, and it hasn't. It's gone up because of fundamentals. Now, yeah, not completely. There's always volatility, but fundamentally, this has gone up because of that.
It would be really cool if you had any data, because the commercial speculators, the big oil companies, the RWEs that are taking a view and taking inventory of credits and then maybe selling them at higher prices. Is there any way of gauging their activity? You would want to know that at these levels, those with the intel are like shoveling it onto their balance sheet. I mean, do you see any of that flow? Can you say anything about that?
Is almost impossible to see. I mean, first of all, you have to decide whether RWE or E.ON or whoever or Uniper buying a permit is buying it because of speculative reasons, or they're buying it because they're underlying. So you can't, that's indistinguishable from the outside. And secondly, the data is just not there. So it's okay. It's impossible.
And then tell me, Lawson, because you've got immense. You're like a squid with tentacles throughout the European, I imagine, the global system. Have you had any conversations with the US, with regulators, with investors? Why are they not adopting best in practice European scheme in the United States? Why are they not allowing a greater footprint for truth discovery via speculative capital?
Well, if you go back to Kyoto in 1997, the climate summit, it was the EU who waved two fingers to the rest of the world and said, well, if you don't care about the climate, we do, and we're going to create this wonderful system. Then the EU goes solo, does it in 2005. It briefly went up to 30, and then, as I said, it went to 0. It's been a disaster for the last 15 years, right? It has not achieved anything like what it should be achieving. In fact, really, apart from 2019, 2020, it achieved nothing. And now we backtracked.
Lawson, remember that, that you could be describing any emerging new sovereign currency. The first 20, 30, 40 years is back to the drawing board repeatedly. The good thing is the tenure that Europe has put into getting things mostly wrong, but now they seem to be mostly on the right. That's something that it's like at the Industrial Revolution. It took, say, 20 years for the Germans to take it on board. It took the US 5 years to take it on board. The rate of adoption gets much quicker, yeah?
But that's exactly going back to your question, is why has the rest of the world not adopted it? Because we haven't got it, or the EU, has not got it right yet. They're getting it right. But everyone was sitting there thinking, well, first of all, the US does not have a federal policy on climate change. It's down, they've got two systems in the US. One is called the WCI, the other's called RGGI. So the WCI West Coast basically goes, California, and then has Nova Scotia and Quebec, which is not really West Coast, but anyway, that's in their system. And then you've got RGGI on the East Coast. But there's nothing national. And certainly not every state has one either. So it's still fledgling. People are grappling about, what do we do next? Some people just don't want to buy this climate change thing. So it's going to require worse and worse storms or whatever it is to get people to realize that actually, okay, Christ, we need to survive here. What do we do?
Yeah. And so for those who've patiently, diligently taken notes, like Mr. Sweeney, the ways of playing this, do you want to expound upon that if like one is intrigued by an infinity trade?
Yeah, I mean, you've got ETFs, exchange traded funds. So you've got KRBN in the US. You've got a couple of smaller ones, but that's the big one. You've got
the KRBN exposure to Europe is how much?
Well, there's two KRBNs. There's the global carbon ETF, which invests in all carbon schemes in the world. So you have basically got Europe, you've got Switzerland, UK, you've got California, the WCI, you've got the Reggie in the States, you've got New Zealand, and then fledgling coming out. But the reality is that the EU ETS is 80% of the world's volume today. So that's, but then they've got a pure KEUA, I think it's called, which is pure Europe, but a much smaller fund. Then you've got a few other funds flying around, a few other ETFs, including Spark Change and a few others.
Okay, in the UK. Oh, and then I just thought, so if you are a billionaire, multi times billionaire philanthropist, and your passion is saving the planet, are you able to buy? Well, you'd buy futures, you would take delivery of the underlying, and then effectively destroy them by committing never to trade them on, and therefore accentuate or accelerate a higher carbon price to bring on the utopia of a mechanism to control the releases.
Yeah, you can buy the futures to eventually put into physical, or you can buy the physical and save yourself that's additional.
So you can buy the physical. You are.
It's more difficult for the private punter. Yeah.
But those funds can take delivery of physical. Yeah.
The ETFs.
Yeah.
They are the KRBN, the Crane Shares one is futures. The Spark Change is backed by physical. So yeah, you can do that. What you want to do is actually, as you described, is get those permits and hang on to them. You don't actually want to destroy them for technical reasons related to that MSR thing, which I won't go into because that'll glaze all of us over. But it's, the best thing to do is to buy this thing and hang on tight, not let them go.
Well, one could also conceive of something which we saw in Bitcoin with the, what is it called? Let's call it grayscale. I'm sure it's called something different, which became it was difficult for institutional investors to take on a speculative position in Bitcoin. And so the only avenue in was coming via this ETF. They did it as a closed end. In UK parlance, an investment trust. In the US parlance, a closed end fund. And then as the price started to accelerate and there was demand to participate, the fund traded at a premium. And then what you could do, if you were an approved investor, you could go back to the manager and ask them to release more units. And so you're getting units at par, which were traded. And so you created this reflexive monster that sent Bitcoin temporarily from 10,000 to 70,000. You can see how that scheme, if these European credits started moving back to the high, took out the high, went to 140, kind of knocked on the door of BASF, etc., you could see a closed-end fund trading at premium and then creating a reflexive loop that would really send these prices, if not to infinity, but certainly into your triple digits. Now, I'm sure I had one last question. Chris, do you have anything else? I just
see at the start. Did you not mention, Lawson, that some industries are not part of this? That they're completely exempt from this? Did you say that, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, that's correct.
So what's going to happen with them then? in the future? What's the EU plans with them? Are they just going to carry on regardless?
No, we'll have. There are moves to get an ETS element set up for the industries outside of the EU ETS today. I think the likelihood is that, to start putting an emission trading scheme on transport or agriculture or buildings is difficult. It's complicated, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. But I think ultimately you will have separate emission trading schemes for those. I haven't done the maths, but let's say that the price of fuel today for me to put into my 2CV, not that it takes much fuel, is.
Do you have a 2CV? You have a 2 chevaux?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Welcome to the club, my friend. What color is yours?
Right.
Hugh, have you not got two?
I know I'm on my second. The first one was, as you know, was torched by radical, angry social members of the Edinburgh community. But what colour is yours, Lawson?
Red.
Red. Wonderful.
Yeah.
You should drive it when you drive a 2 chevaux, a Citroën 2CV, which refers to it having a horsepower of 2, similar to a horse. I don't know. But when I drive it on this island, it is a dopamine theatre. Just French. Every French person has a story to relate from childhood about a 2 chevaux, and they wave, they smile.
Yeah, over here. I mean, I've had different car. I got a Morgan V8, 1994. That makes a fantastic sound and everything. And people smile, but the 2CV is like everybody has to stop and talk. And I used to have one. Every time you go to the petrol station, and this is in England, let alone France. So yeah, no, it's hilarious.
I remember,
but the point is that the proportion of tax in the UK on fuel is so high that in order for the carbon price to make a difference to me in terms of my fuel consumption, I don't know where it would need to be, but say it needs to be up at 700. I don't know what that number is, and therefore you can't really put the two schemes together. But I do think you will get schemes coming through. And then one other point, actually, you mentioned earlier, which I thought I'd mentioned, is that, that people say, well, hang on a minute, isn't this really stupid? Isn't Europe shooting itself in the foot? Isn't it not going to make itself completely uncompetitive in the world domain? Unchecked, yes, of course it would. But that's why they're talking about bringing together something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, another long word, or 4 words, CBAM for short. And CBAM basically saying, look, if you want to come and trade in Europe, you're welcome under the usual guises and rules, but now you'll have to pay an equivalent carbon cost to the domestic producers. So that's being put together.
I've heard about that, and that's we have to go there, but I'm not enthusiastic that we're going to see that anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. I think it'd take a few years. I just realized my battery is running low. I got 12%. We're okay. No,
I want to use the 12% because my final big question is wider application. I know the system's had a long time gelling, but I love it. But I want to ask you, like you said, I think for a period of at least 10 years, maybe longer, you got 95% free allowance if you're a large corporate. And therefore, that was a wealth transfer from European citizens to European corporates to the tune of probably, would you care to guess?
Is it a wealth transfer? Because they're still having to pay 5%. But
5%, but they were given 95% of each year. They were effectively given allowances, which that 1.5 billion, a large component of that will be the legacy of the free allowances that they were given in the run up to the change in the system. Yeah.
But ultimately they are having to buy net 5%, aren't they?
Okay. Well, let me turn it around. I think there is scope for a public policy similar at the at the personal level, for a kind of again, the number one issue for the electorate. I mean, the stupid taxes with the UK government, etc. But young people in the generation coming through, it's climate. Okay, and if you could actually offer another solution and bring it to people. So what I want to propose is that we can make a rough rule of thumb in terms of the average household consumes X tons of, or is responsible for the emission of X tons of carbon, right? Yeah, and let's say it's 50 tons, and I would propose that you give people 50 tons of carbon credit rights for 10 years, and effectively you're giving them what could be thought of as a digital asset. You're giving them an asset. You're giving them something which has a value moving forward, and you say, "Hey, listen, here's a gift, right? But from year 10, actually, we're going to, like your tax, we're going to have an emissions audit on you, and if you will have to pay back 50 each year from this reserve that we've given you. But if you're really smart and you cut your emissions, maybe your emissions won't be 50, maybe they'll be 15, and so you'll retain something. We're creating an asset class for people who have nothing. We're giving it to you as your right, but in 10 years' time, we're going to start effectively a tax, and so it's a tax on your behavior. You keep telling us you want to save the planet. Here's a way where we save the planet, and we give you a new financial asset that could actually lift you out of poverty or give you another jewel in your crown." How crazy is that?
No, I think, I mean, ultimately, every decision we make, whether corporate or individuals, will have to have a climate component involved in it. It has to. If we're going to say, if we believe that the climate is in danger, and that if we believe that humans can fix that, then we have to go down that route. And we are just nibbling at it today.
Yeah. I just don't think anyone's conceiving of it. It's kind of, is it a Trojan horse? But giving the population an asset class, an emerging asset class, which you say could have an infinite price depending on how behavior pivots in the future.
Yeah,
I want to say that's a vote winner, but the conservatism of the status quo is you're proposing another tax on people, and therefore politicians are not signing up for it. Anyway, I think we've gone. We're at risk of losing your battery power.
no, it's okay, I've just fixed it.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I think there are solutions out there, and I think I've got a couple bubbling away in my background, which I'm being a little bit coy about, but it's not on that scale yet. But I do think there's some things we can do, and there's a company I'm involved in which is going down that route at the moment, ish.
Excellent. I'm done. I'm going to try and write this up. We're going to put it out. Chris, you're looking a bit like, I don't know, Jacques Cousteau there in the dark. I'm getting ready to see you kind of go like that.
No, it's not my fault. It's not.
You see people doing odd things in the rooms behind you. They're like,
you want to see there's all sorts going on there, mate. That's tame. You want to see what I've seen? I've seen plenty. Let me tell you, but yeah.
We're going back.
We saw an OnlyFans session once. It was pretty X-rated. But anyway, enough about that. Enough about my neighbours. Yeah, the sun's went down here, so I seem to have disappeared into darkness. But yeah, I'm still here.
We see you. I do want to thank everyone for their support. We are now doing about 6,000 hits on the Apple Podcast and associated Spotify's.
Audited figures, by the way, because we pulled someone else over the coals of audited figures 11 weeks ago. Our figures are audited, not for public consumption, but they are audited. But
we really need it at 10,000. The hack works because the algo will start pushing asset capitalism to the many. So
yeah, but you were on Bloomberg, and they asked you the name of the pod. You didn't even give the name right. You said the name of the podcast was Acid Capitalism. It's not that. It's your name or it's acid capitalist. It's not acid capitalism. You were on the audience. He was on a worldwide audience there, and they asked him what's the name of the podcast, and he got it wrong. Anyway,
I was concentrating. My armpits were perspiring.
Saying you've done all this great analysis, and the simple question is, "What's the name of your podcast?" And he says the wrong name.
Well, I'm on Asian CNBC tonight, and I will try and rectify that.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Lawson, for your time. It's been a pleasure to meet you. I think I've learned a lot. I think we've all learned a lot. Complicated stuff, but yeah, no, it's great to have someone like yourself. You know, that's a great thing about the world, isn't it? Someone gets a topic and they go deep and they can share that knowledge with everybody else. You know, it's great. You know, it really is. It's inspiring. Even if you don't understand it, it's inspiring to hear it, to try and get a bit of it, and then next time you understand more and more and more. And that's how we all grow as a society, I think, no matter what the subject matter is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, no, it's been great meeting you guys and chatting. Always appreciate that.
And Lawson, good luck with the whatever. Yeah, I know you're ruminating in that head for steps.
You'll be buying the plot next door in St. Bart's, Lawson. Won't be long before you're over there. You'll have a bigger place in Hendry, eh?
on stilts, yeah.
I mean, talking of which, you know, I spent over 200,000 of those European euros putting in.
What is this? Here we go.
Solar panels. My friends at EDF came knocking and said, "Oh, you know, you're taking too much electricity." I'm like, "Says who? I need it." And I'm like, "Well, we're going to cut you by 2/3." So I spent 200 grand. My draw on the network is down by 2/3. And just to put, you know, in perspective where European energy prices are, my bill this year is higher than it was last year. So my bill for the 1/3 is actually greater than the run rate on 100% the previous year, and I've had to spend 200 grand.
France had pretty good, but I thought France was protecting consumers on that stuff well. I thought the French government had stepped in to sort of protect consumers. Aren't you under the French government system out there? No?
Yeah, but maybe they look at the same parts. Who knows? Anyway, Lawson will.
So you surf? Do you kite surf as well?
No, kite surf. Jesus, I mean, surfing's hard enough. Kite surf, I don't have that coordination thing, you know.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, there's only so much like beating of my ego I can take from starting at 0 and doing something incompetently 10,000 times before I get it.
I started this summer. I started doing e-foil.
Oh yeah,
brilliant.
E-foil is that? What's the E in the foil that you've actually got a battery that's taking you along?
Yeah, you got a battery and you got a mast underneath it, so you ride above the water, and you got a gun on your hand, kind of thing.
But they're the highest share, no? I mean, what's the price on one of those?
Yeah, they're not cheap. 10 grand. Yeah.
10 grand. Ooh, yeah, I thought about it and I was like, not for 10 grand.
I think a man of your means can do that.
Listen.
Get the violin out, Lawson. He's about to go off on one. Get the violin out for the tour. The tour band. Here we go.
Asset rich, but so poor. You know, apart from staying in this place when the clients aren't here, you know, I'm camping. But Chris, let's end. Thank you everyone for listening. Hendry _Hugh on Twitter. Lawson, are you on Twitter? Are there any?
He's on Twitter. Is he on Twitter? What
yeah.
ridiculous! This man's prolific on Twitter. I've been checking out Lawson's Twitter. He's prolific on there.
Yeah, I'm flattered that I have quite a high following. But,
what's your handle? Have you got some? Is it? I think you've got quite a normal handle. It's not some sort of. Last week's guest's handle was Jam Croissant, but I think yours is a bit more kind of straight.
Yeah, I think so. I'm an analyst, you know, Christ.
But please tell us for the community.
Well, it's Lawson Steele 3 at Lawson Steele 3.
So is there another 2 Lawson Steeles out there? And who are they? Who's Lawson Steele 1? Who's Lawson Steele 2?
Well, there's my idiocy with the technology. Well, I'm reasonably technological.
Oh, so you're Lawson Steele 1 and 2.
Yeah.
We don't know which version we're getting.
I forgot, and then I discovered it a few months ago, and I thought, oh, Lawson Steele's mine, because it asked me for my passport. I put a password in, I thought, oh, it's mine. And I thought, well, I can't change Lawson Steele 3 back to Lawson Steele now, so...
This worries me. You're the man leading this sort of European analysis of climate change. Hugh's this leading hedge fund manager that struggles with basic maths. These things worry me sometimes, or the world worries me.
It shouldn't worry you, Chris. It just means it shows the commitment that Lawson and I have to the world of deep thinking, that it doesn't leave much scope or room for the practicalities of the more mundane.
Exactly. Well, we will end there, people. If you want a cool hat like me and Hugh, you can go to www.acidcap.com, get your credit card out. Don't buy some carbon credits, buy a hat. And we will see you again next week. It's our pleasure to have Lawson on board. Hopefully he'll come back and see us. Hopefully we've not bored him too much or antagonized him too much. We can have him back. We'll see you all next week. Thank you very much. Good night and God bless.